Good morning or good afternoon or good evening to everybody might be watching. My name is Jonathan Brummer. Thanks for tuning into another episode on the channel here. I had a great start to the day and went for a lovely run, which I really enjoyed. And my 4-year-old daughter has told me that she's preparing us a feast. So I'm looking forward to and enjoying that. To get to business, this channel is called 5 Before, 5 After, and it is dedicated to helping South Africans navigate what's called the fragile decade. And those are the 5 years before and after retirement. And really the choices you make during this period will really determine the outcome of your retirement. So really focused on retirement income strategies for South African retirees. Today, I'll be going through an article I wrote all about what a safe withdrawal rate from a pool of capital is. And so I'll be going through some examples and just telling you about how the research has been done. I need to warn you up front that this is slightly technical in nature. I'll do my best to just explain it very simply, but just go with me through the discussion here, and I'm sure you'll understand what we're doing. So let's frame the question quickly. Assume you're about to retire. You've saved up some money, however much that might be, and now you need to withdraw from it to fund your monthly expenses. And the question is, well, how much can I take? And naturally, if you think about it, if you take too much, you're going to spend it all and it's not going to last for the duration of your retirement. On the other hand, we don't want to take too little because you've spent a long time building this up and it's time to enjoy that money now and have enough to fund all the expenses that you want to. So there's a balance here. And the question is, well, how much can I withdraw? I'm not the first person to have researched this. In the 1990s, a guy by the name of Bill Bingham did the same research, and he basically came up with this thing called the 4% rule, which you may have heard about. And we'll be applying a similar methodology to the South African context today. So in Bill Bingham's work, he looked at historical periods and he looked at a 30-year period. And what we're doing, actually looking forward and using many more simulations, and not just kind of 30-year periods, but I'll explain that a little bit more in a second. First, let's frame the problem again a little bit here. There are two very important unknowns that you have as a retiree getting close to or being in retirement. The first is what we call longevity risk. And all that means is I don't know when I'm going to die. We don't know when that day is. We know that people are living longer and longer. And for a 65-year-old, a good idea is that we have to plan for about 30 years. That's a long period to plan for. And most likely is enough and gives us time to adjust. So you can look at actuarial tables. What I would caution you against is trying to think that just because on average people, for example, live 20 years or 25 years, that you will live 20 or 25 years. Yours could be much longer, much shorter. And to make sure we don't run out, we have to assume a long period. So typically we use 30 years, which is what I've done for the most part in the research here. The second point is what's called sequence of returns risk, the other very big unknown that we have, and that's going to make a very big impact. I've written an article about that as well and done a video, and I'll link to those. But the basic idea here is that two retirees can earn the exact same return on average for the duration of their retirement. But if they get them in different orders, if the sequence of those returns is different, they will have a very different outcome. And especially poor market returns and negative returns at the beginning of retirement is very damaging to retirement income. And if you go look at that article of the video, you'll see the outcome varies drastically. The important thing here is that we've got no control over what the sequence is going to be. And so we have to find a way around this without knowing what it's going to be, but a way to manage this risk. So really, that's what this research is trying to help us with. Let's get into how we've set this up. So here comes the slightly technical part, which I'll explain to you. The first thing we have to do is to build some portfolio. So I'm going to be using an example of a person retiring, and they start with, let's say, R1 million. And every year they get to take some money out of that portfolio. Every year, we'll assume a growth rate on the portfolio, and then we'll keep track after year 1, year 2, year 3, all the way out to year 30 and beyond. And we'll see what the value of the portfolio is. Now, of course, if that value continues being positive, the money hasn't run out, then that's a good thing. If it does run out, then it tells us, well, that isn't a sustainable portfolio. So in fact, let me just show you some charts here quickly. So in this chart, what I've done is exactly as I've said here. Someone starts on the left with R1 million. In this case, they take out 5%. So if you started with R1 million, that means you take out 50,000 Rand in year 1. That's 5% of $1 million. And the next year, we increase that by inflation. So every year, you increase your 50,000 by inflation. So if inflation was 10%, the 50,000 becomes 55,000, and so on every year. And each of these lines represents a possible path that we could take. And the difference between these is just a difference in market return. So we don't know what the sequence is going to be. We don't know how high or how low it's going to be. And so we have to test multiple of these scenarios. And in this case, I've done 1,000. So I'm testing 1,000 different possible futures in this chart. So the other thing to take from this chart is when you look at the right-hand side, look all the way to the right here, if the line reaches the end, it means the money has lasted for 30 years. So if we look at this one line at the top, this very lucky person, whenever they might have retired, started with R1 million, they withdrew 5% and then increased that by inflation every year. And by the end, they actually had almost 60 million. Okay? They had a very lucky streak. They had a lot more left by the end. But you can also see at the bottom that some of these lines don't reach the end. So they run out at some point before the 30. And so the methodology we're using is we look right at the end. We know we've tested 1,000. And if, for example, 800 of the lines reach the end, then 800 out of 1,000, that's 80%. We can say that this strategy has an 80% chance of success. Okay, hope that makes sense. So let's change it. So instead of 5%, someone decides they're going to take 10%. So on R1 million, you're taking 100,000 Rand in the first year and then increasing that with inflation. Big difference you can see in this chart. So in the case of a 10% return, only 3 lines ended up reaching the end. And the majority of them around some point before, sometimes after 10 years, sometimes only after 20 years or so. But you can see that the probability that this strategy, that withdrawing 10% lasts 30 years, is much lower. Okay, so that, I think, visually helps you understand what the research here is trying to do. So let's go back. First thing, build a portfolio. What I'm doing then is I'm looking at different asset classes. So the portfolio is made up of different investment strategies. Sometimes they are conservative, targeting a low return, but having a lower risk, so lower up and down movement. And other times they would have a higher equity allocation, which means they're trying to target a higher return, but are going to move up and down. So we'll see that a bit later. That's the first thing. We're testing different retirement portfolios. To know that we've come up with forward-looking expectations, so we're not just using historical returns. Those can lead to very strange results. So we're looking at reasonable forward-looking expectations for each of these asset classes. And I'll be updating these on an annual basis to just see how those change. Then, as I've explained, we run 1,000 possible outcomes, and then we check over a 30-year retirement duration, and we see what the success rate is. And as I've said, we define the success if the money lasted for 30 years. If that line got to the end, that's a successful trial. Right, so what were the results? Here's our first scenario, very straightforward one. As I've said, you start with a particular withdrawal rate and you just increase then by inflation every year. So after the first year, you don't care about the rate of withdrawal. In our example of 5%, you'd have $1 million, you withdraw 50,000, and you increase the 50,000 by inflation each year, not worrying about the percentage of the total portfolio. This chart gives us all the information we need here. So each of these lines gives us the first year percentage withdrawal that leads to 90% probability of success. So in other words, 90 or 900 of the 1,000 parts that we tested got to the end. And you can see that they're all in the region of 4%, some slightly above, others a little bit below 4%. So it validates what William Bengen's work around the 4% rule and says that that indeed is a similar outcome given current market situations in South Africa. You can also see that it's not the same for all the different asset allocations. So what I've got here, each line is a different equity weighting. So if you look at this one, it says 60. That means 60% of the portfolio was in equities and the other 40% was in fixed income. And in that case, the safe withdrawal rate was 4.3%. So on R1 million in the first year, you can take 43,000 Rand as a withdrawal and then increase it by inflation every year. And that will then have a good chance of lasting for 30 years. For other allocations slightly lower, you can see it's a little bit higher. I think what's interesting is that for a very high equity allocation, so all the way on the right, you can see 100% allocated to equities. And people often think that you just have to try and target the highest return possible. But indeed, that leads to a much lower safe withdrawal rate, 3.5%. And the reason is that you do tend to get higher returns with equity, but it comes with more up and down movement. That means at certain times the market can, decrease quite a lot. And when you're taking money out of a portfolio, negative returns, the market being down is very damaging. We try to avoid that. So there's this balance between the return, but also the volatility of that return, up and down movement of that return. And actually you find that having a bit more of a balanced mix between different asset classes leads to better results. I'll link to some articles that you can also read about how we actually determine the asset allocation. But for our first scenario, so let's just start there. The simple one, around 4% at the current market rates, about 4.3%. Is a good initial withdrawal. Right, let's make this slightly more interesting. Life isn't as, straightforward as what we've made here. People adjust to what happens in the world. And so we need to find a way to try and model that and see, well, how does that impact this number? So in this article, in this research, I've come up with a few different strategies that people use that show us what the impact of flexibility is. So let me explain how those work. Look at this chart for me for a moment first. So this blue line is nothing else than the top chart that we looked at. So if I go here quickly, you'll see that if I go at the top here, that gives us that shape. If we drew a line from those connecting all those top points, that is this blue line at the bottom in this chart. Okay, so that's our baseline. Now we say, well, let's make some adjustments here. The first one is if markets were negative last year, then don't give yourself an inflationary increase. Fairly simple one to implement. You literally, at the point when it's time to increase your investment, you just say, did markets have a positive year last year or a negative one? If it was negative, just keep the same income. So don't give yourself an increase. You don't have to decrease it. Just don't give yourself an increase and then wait until next year. If next year markets were positive last year, then give yourself an increase. So just by doing that, what's the impact? That's the green line over here. And you can see that the safe withdrawal rate, the initial income that you can take, has actually increased quite significantly. If we stick with our 60% equity example over here, that went from 4.3% to something like 4.7%. So if you can start retirement with the idea that if markets are negative, I'll just keep my income the same, you can actually start with something like 4.7% as a withdrawal rather than 4.3%. So you get more right from the first year. That's our first scenario, first adjustment that you can make on an ongoing basis. The second one is called the retirement smile. If you're interested in these things, you may have come across this. A researcher in the US by the name of David Blanchett did this research and came up a curve. And it basically showed that Americans decrease their expenses over time. So in fact, expenses as you age decreases. And I think it makes sense to many. When you're young and active, you may be traveling, you're doing more things, you're spending more money. And as we get older, you tend to simplify your life and you're spending less. And in fact, he showed that that was indeed the case. I've done some similar research in South Africa, and I will link to that article so that you can read. In this case, I modeled this behavior by saying, in the first 10 years, your income would be wherever you set it. But from 11 to 20, so the next 10 years, we decrease it by 10%. And then after year 20, we decrease it by 10% again. Okay, so think about kind of these steps. It stays at this level. After 10 years, we take it down 10% for 10 years, and then it goes down 10% again. And then we keep it the same to the end. If you do that, that's this orange line. And again, we can see that's above both the blue and the green line for most allocations here. And if we keep our 60% example that we've been using, we go from 4.3. If you don't adjust for inflation when markets are down, we go to 4.7. And if you also plan to spend it less as you age, that actually gets very close to 5% or 4.9%. So again, and then the last one is I said, well, what if you do both? What if you're willing to, when markets are negative, not give yourself an increase? And if you plan to, as you age, spend slightly less in your later years, what does that do? That's the red line. So you can see the red line again, let's look at our 60% of the year. We go all the way to about 5.3. So from where we started at 4.3, all the way up to where we ended at 5.3, that's a significant increase in the initial income that you can take from your capital. If you have in mind that at the start, you're not going to be rigid in your income, but you'll be able to adjust as things change, as I think most people are probably able to do. Again, there's no right or wrong here. It's really up to you to choose, but it does, I think, give you some insight into the effect of different choices you can have. Those choices are amending the income you've got every year, as I've shown. Other choices, obviously, you have is what your investment strategy is, so what the equity allocation might be. And I'll link to some articles there and do some more videos in future to explain that. I hope that was useful and stimulates your thinking. And if you'd like to get in touch, please do subscribe to the newsletter. The link will be in the description. That's it. Thank you. Have a good day.